Tucked away in the turquoise waters of the Bay of Bengal lies a small island that has fascinated explorers, scientists, and storytellers for centuries. But what draws attention to this patch of paradise isn't its pristine beaches or lush jungles. It's the people who live there, the Sentinelese, an uncontacted tribe that has fiercely protected its isolation for thousands of years. For most outsiders, North Sentinel Island offers a glimpse into humanity's distant past, a living window into how early humans may have survived before modern civilization. But for a few unfortunate souls, this mysterious island has become their final resting place. The Sentinelese remain one of the last truly uncontacted peoples on Earth. They live a hunter-gatherer lifestyle, reject all contact with outsiders, and have preserved a culture, language, and worldview that remain almost entirely unknown. Today we'll dive deep into their story, exploring the island's history of contact, what little we know about the Sentinelese way of life, and the complex ethical questions their existence raises. North Sentinel Island covers about 60 square kilometers, or roughly 23 square miles, and sits around 40 kilometers, 22 miles, from the larger Andaman Islands. These islands are home to various indigenous groups, collectively known as the Andamanese, peoples like the Onge, the Great Andamanese, and the Jarawa. These groups are believed to be direct descendants of some of the first modern humans to reach Southeast Asia, possibly more than 40,000 years ago. It's likely the Sentinelese share this deep ancestry. They've inhabited their island for tens of thousands of years, long before the rise of any known civilization. While the world around them evolved through waves of colonization, industrialization, and globalization, the Sentinelese remained almost completely untouched. But untouched doesn't mean unknown. Throughout the past few centuries, outsiders have attempted contact, some peaceful, many not. The result has been a tense history of misunderstanding, disease, and violence. Although the Andaman Islands were known to traders and sailors for centuries, the first documented mention of North Sentinel came in 1771, when John Ritchie of the East India Company reported seeing distant lights from the island. He never landed, nor did he attempt contact. Nearly a century later, in 1867, an Indian merchant ship called the Nineveh, often spelled Nino, wrecked on a reef near North Sentinel during a monsoon. The crew of 86 men survived and reached the beach safely. For 2 days, they believed they'd escaped the worst of their ordeal. Then, on the third day, the Sentinelese attacked. The ship's captain later described how the islanders fired arrows tipped with iron, likely scavenged from shipwrecks. The survivors managed to fend off the attack using sticks and debris until a Royal Navy ship rescued them. Even this early encounter revealed something fascinating. The Sentinelese already possessed iron-tipped weapons, evidence that they scavenged metal long before modern outsiders arrived. When the British expanded their colonial reach into the Andaman Islands, North Sentinel was officially claimed but largely ignored. The nearby islands weren't as fortunate. Colonization brought disease, forced labor, and cultural collapse to the Andamanese. Within decades, half of their population was wiped out. Among the colonial administrators was Maurice Vidal Portman, a British officer whose bizarre fascination with the indigenous people was matched only by his arrogance. Portman had a habit of photographing Andamanese men in staged, classical poses, and reportedly took disturbing measurements of their bodies, including their genitals, in the name of science. In 1880, driven by curiosity, Portman organized an expedition to North Sentinel Island. He brought a large team of Indian, Burmese, and Andamanese assistants, hoping to make contact. When they arrived, they found abandoned huts, fires still smoldering, and traces of recent activity, but no people. A few days later, on a second trip, Portman and his men came across a small group hiding in the forest. Accounts differ, but Portman's own journal states that they captured 6 Sentinelese, an elderly couple and 4 children, and took them to Port Blair, the colonial capital. The results were tragic and predictable. The 2 adults quickly fell ill and died from exposure to foreign diseases. The terrified children were returned to the island with gifts, but by then, It was too late. The disease likely spread to the rest of the tribe. Portman later admitted that his expedition did nothing more than increase their terror and hostility toward all comers. That one reckless act may have poisoned relations for centuries. After Portman's disastrous mission, North Sentinel Island faded from colonial interest. For decades it was left alone, save for occasional sightings of islanders on the beaches or hostile arrows fired at passing ships. One rare recorded event occurred in 1896, when 3 Indian convicts escaped from the penal colony in Port Blair and attempted to flee by raft. Days later, 2 bodies were found washed up on reefs, and the third was discovered on the island, killed by arrows. It was a grim reminder that the Sentinelese were still there, still guarding their home. For nearly 60 years, no one dared approach North Sentinel. Then, in 1956, newly independent India officially declared the island a tribal reserve, banning anyone from coming within 3 nautical miles. But curiosity remained. In the 1970s, the Indian government began cautious contact expeditions. Led by anthropologist T.N. Pandit, teams sailed close to the island and left gifts, coconuts, pots, and metal tools on the beaches. On one visit, they found abandoned huts, fires, and footprints, proof that the tribe was watching. By 1974, a film crew joined one of these expeditions to document the last uncontacted tribe. They offered gifts, including a live pig and a toy car, and waited offshore. Eventually, the Sentinelese emerged, bows in hand, shouting warnings. When one of the filmmakers stepped closer, an arrow struck him in the leg. The tribe buried the pig, ignored the toy car, but kept the coconuts and metal pans. It was a clear message. We don't want you here, but we'll take the good stuff. Later visits included attempts to communicate through neighboring tribes, but the languages weren't mutually intelligible. The Ong men who accompanied expeditions reported that the Sentinelese seemed angry or mocking, though no words could be understood. Then, in 1981, something extraordinary happened. A Hong Kong freighter called the Primrose ran aground on the island's reef during a storm. The crew of 31 survived the wreck and took shelter on the ship, which was stuck but stable. At first, relief set in. They weren't sinking. But the next morning, the real nightmare began. The crew spotted dozens of small, naked men gathering on the beach with bows and spears. The Sentinelese began building makeshift rafts, preparing to approach. The terrified sailors armed themselves with axes and flare guns and radioed for help, begging not for rescue, but for weapons. Fortunately, rough seas kept the Sentinelese from reaching them, and after several tense days, helicopters managed to evacuate the entire crew. When the storm finally passed, the Primrose remained, filled with metal, glass, and strange technologies. For the Sentinelese, it must have felt like a gift from the gods. Imagine seeing a massive steel ship for the first time, its cabins, tools, and machinery completely alien to your world. For them, exploring it would have been like us boarding a UFO. After the Primrose incident, curiosity about the Sentinelese surged again. Despite the tribe's fierce reputation, the Indian government believed contact might still be possible, and even beneficial. For several years, anthropologists and officials continued to approach the island, hoping that a friendly relationship might eventually form. In 1991, something unexpected happened. For the first time, the Sentinelese didn't respond to visitors with hostility. When Indian officials approached by boat, the islanders gestured for them to come closer and bring more coconuts. The visitors tossed the fruit into the shallow water, and to everyone's surprise, some Sentinelese men waded into the sea to collect them. It was a small but monumental moment, peaceful contact after centuries of isolation. A few weeks later, another expedition returned. This time, the Sentinelese accepted the gifts and allowed close-up photos and video footage to be taken. They even approached the boats without weapons. At one point, a crew member accidentally hit a Sentinelese woman with a tossed coconut, knocking her over. Thankfully, she stood back up laughing, and no one appeared angry. But the peace didn't last long. Before the team left, one islander made a threatening gesture with a knife, a subtle reminder that boundaries still existed. After these brief encounters, the Indian government decided to send salvage teams to dismantle the Primrose wreck, which still sat stranded on the reef. The salvage operation lasted almost a year and a half. Teams of laborers worked just a few hundred feet from the island's shore, cutting apart the massive ship for scrap metal. Throughout this time, groups of Sentinelese watched from the beach or paddled out in small canoes to observe. Interestingly, their behavior was mostly peaceful. They occasionally accepted fruit and bananas from the workers, and they even climbed aboard parts of the wreck to see what was happening. The salvage team reported that the islanders seemed fascinated, but also frightened, by the workers' blowtorches and tools. When offered scrap metal, the Sentinelese only seemed interested in flat pieces rather than rods or tubes, suggesting that they used the metal to make cutting tools or arrowheads rather than structural implements. Once the salvage work ended, visits became rare again, and as quickly as the short era of contact began, it was over. The Sentinelese went back to isolation, perhaps wary of the outsiders who kept coming and going. By the mid-1990s, the Indian government began to question whether these contact missions were wise at all. The other Andamanese tribes who'd been integrated into modern society were suffering from disease, alcoholism, malnutrition, and cultural collapse. Officials realized that, while the Sentinelese might seem primitive, they were healthy, self-sufficient, and thriving. There was no reason to disturb them. So, in 1996, India officially ended all attempts at contact. The policy shifted to a hands-off approach. Watch from afar but never interfere. The island remained off-limits to all outsiders, protected by law. Still, occasional monitoring missions continued, usually after natural disasters, to ensure the tribe was safe. In 2004, a devastating earthquake and tsunami struck the Indian Ocean, killing hundreds of thousands of people across Asia. Concern grew that the massive waves had wiped out the tiny population of North Sentinel Island. When the Indian Coast Guard flew over the island days later, they were stunned. Not only were the Sentinelese alive, they were standing on the beach, shooting arrows at the helicopter. One man even climbed a tree to get a better angle. The images made headlines around the world. The tribe had survived, proving once again their resilience and adaptability. The government later confirmed that the island itself had been lifted about 2 meters by the earthquake, exposing parts of the coral reef. Even from above, observers could see that the Sentinelese were still healthy, their huts intact, their fires burning. Whatever else had changed in the world, their way of life hadn't. Unfortunately, peace didn't last forever. In 2006, 2 fishermen illegally entered the restricted zone around the island to hunt for mud crabs. After a night of heavy drinking, their boat drifted too close to shore. At dawn, the Sentinelese noticed the intruders. What happened next was brutal, but predictable. The tribe attacked and killed both men. Authorities tried to recover the bodies, but every attempt was met with a barrage of arrows. Eventually, officials gave up, concluding that the islanders had buried the bodies themselves. Photos from the incident show the Sentinelese inspecting the fishermen's boat, a chilling reminder that they tolerated no trespassers. The event marked the first known deaths on the island in over a century. The next, and most infamous, encounter would come more than a decade later, in 2018. John Allen Chow was an American missionary and adventurer from Alabama, born in 1991. From a young age, he was fascinated by stories of explorers and missionaries, especially Robinson Crusoe and the Sign of the Beaver, tales of survival and friendship between outsiders and natives. As an adult, Chow devoted himself to Christianity and the idea of spreading the gospel to unreached tribes. He trained in wilderness survival, studied anthropology, and even practiced linguistic techniques for communicating with uncontacted peoples. But his ultimate dream was North Sentinel Island, a place he called Satan's last stronghold. In October 2018, he arrived in Port Blair, the Andaman capital, and began planning his mission. He paid a group of local fishermen to take him illegally within range of the island. On November 14th, Chow paddled toward the island in a small kayak. As he approached, he shouted to the Sentinelese that, "Jesus loves you," and tossed them a large fish as a gift. Two men appeared on the shore, gesturing aggressively but not firing arrows. Chow retreated that day, unharmed but excited. He believed he'd made a connection. The next day he returned. This time several Sentinelese men, women, and even children appeared, mocking him and laughing as he tried to mimic their words. He later wrote in his journal, "I tried to parrot their words back at them. They burst out laughing most of the time, so they were probably insulting me." He began to sing hymns, but their laughter faded, replaced by silence. Then, as he stepped from his kayak, a child raised a bow and fired an arrow. It struck Chow's Bible, which he held in front of his chest. He fled, swimming back to his boat nearly a mile away. That night, he prayed and wrote what would become his final entry. "Lord, let your will be done. If I'm killed, let it be for your glory." On the morning of November 17th, Chow made his third trip to the island. The fishermen who had smuggled him there stayed offshore, watching from a distance. They saw the islanders gather on the beach. There was shouting, then silence. Soon after, they saw the Sentinelese dragging a body across the sand and burying it. John Allen Chow was dead. When word reached the authorities, outrage erupted. Missionary groups called him a martyr. Anthropologists called him reckless. His father blamed the extreme evangelical culture that had encouraged his son to risk everything. In the end, the Indian government refused to retrieve his body, fearing that doing so could expose the tribe to deadly diseases. The island was once again sealed off, perhaps for good. Chow's story reignited global debate about uncontacted tribes. Should we leave them alone? Should we try to help them, even at the risk of wiping them out? The consensus among anthropologists is clear. The Sentinelese don't need us. They have survived countless storms, both literal and historical, on their own terms. Every time outsiders interfered, it brought only disease, fear, and death. Since 2018, the island has remained completely off limits. From time to time, Indian authorities check from a distance, confirming that the tribe is still healthy and active. But no one has set foot there since Chow's death, and no one should. Now that we've traced the long, messy history of contact and near contact, let's zoom in on the island itself and what we can infer, carefully, about the Sentinelese. North Sentinel is small, about 60 square kilometers, or roughly 23 square miles. Picture a forested square lifted out of the Bay of Bengal, ringed by bright, shallow reefs. After the massive 2004 earthquake, the island reportedly rose about 2 meters, exposing even more coral around the rim. From the air, you can make out hilly interior ridges. The two highest points reach around 400 feet. That elevation matters in a tsunami zone. The canopy is dense tropical broadleaf, and while coconuts don't grow there naturally, the Sentinelese clearly love them. Gift parties over the years showed how eagerly they gathered floating or tossed coconuts. Food seems plentiful. Observers have noted coconut crabs, sea turtles, reef fish, shellfish, and birds. There's debate about feral pigs and whether skull piles seen long ago were local or imported. But either way, the sea appears to be the main pantry. Healthy physiques seen from a distance, and the fact that children are regularly visible in groups, suggest a diet and lifestyle that work. Still, the island's small size caps the population. Most estimates put them in the dozens to low hundreds, often quoted as 50 to 400 people at any one time. That's a razor-thin margin for a society facing disease threats from the outside world. What about technology? Here's where North Sentinel gets especially fascinating. The Sentinelese have metal tools, knives, adzes, arrowheads, despite having no smelting or forging tradition we know of. How does that add up? Through salvage, scavenging, and ingenious cold working. The Primrose Wreck alone supplied a windfall of flat plate and other metals. Like many indigenous groups globally who encountered iron before learning to smelt it, the Sentinelese likely repurposed sheet metal by scoring it with hard stone, bending until it snaps, and then grinding edges sharp with abrasive rock. A very hot fire can help soften thinner metal for crude hammering, but there's no evidence of furnaces, bellows, or controlled metallurgy. Workers who salvaged the Primrose noticed the Sentinelese favored flat scraps over rods, which makes sense if your goal is to cut, score, and grind simple, deadly tools. Their knives, when glimpsed up close, show obvious ground edges. Some are carried tucked into waist belts along with other everyday tools. Their bows are long, flat bows. The arrows are equally striking, often as tall as the shooter, with oversized barbed heads ideal for fishing and for holding prey once struck. Those barbs are practical on reef shallows, where retrieval matters. They also use heavy thrusting or throwing spears. For woodworking and boat building, men carry adzes. One famous clip shows a man bonking a visitor's boat with his adze as a warning. Friendly enough to tap, clear enough to communicate. Their boats are narrow outrigger canoes, pushed by long poles rather than paddles, which means they stay in shallow waters. That limitation is probably cultural and practical more than technical. With reefs, currents, and a tiny population, venturing into open water is a lot of risk for limited reward. We know they understand boats. They seized a full-sized fishing vessel in 2006 after killing 2 trespassing fishermen. Whether they repurposed hooks, lines, or modern gear from that boat is unknown, but it would be surprising if they didn't experiment. So are the Sentinelese Stone Age? That label doesn't quite fit. They use stone techniques, yes, but also metal, just not metal they smelt themselves. In old anthropological terms, Neolithic implies agriculture and domesticated animals. That's not the case here. Mesolithic, Paleolithic, these are museum words. The simplest, least misleading description is a self-sufficient, uncontacted hunter-gatherer people who incorporate salvaged metal into traditional toolkits. Clothing and adornment are minimal. Fiber belts, headbands, necklaces. Men often wear a thick waist belt that doubles as a tool holster. Body paint and ornamentation vary, and like many small societies, symbols on the body likely carry social meaning we can't decode from photos alone. Language? Entirely unknown. Attempts to communicate via neighboring Andamanese languages failed. Whatever they speak has diverged for so long that mutual intelligibility is gone. Genetics and physical appearance sometimes lead outsiders to assume African origin, but that's a red herring. Andamanese peoples are most closely related to other East/Southeast Asian lineages. Looks like is not is. From a distance, the Sentinelese appear healthy. That's the key point. Their way of life meets their needs. When other Andaman groups were drawn into the modern economy, the result was often catastrophic. Disease, alcohol, poor nutrition, dependence, and loss of cultural anchors. There were even grotesque human safari tours aimed at gawking at the Jarawa. That debacle alone should warn us against romantic invasions disguised as help. So what do we owe the Sentinelese? In practice, the current Indian policy, eyes on, hands off, is the ethical minimum. Protect their land and waters, enforce the exclusion zone, and intervene only to keep outsiders away. No missions, no study camps, no friendly drop-ins. If the Sentinelese ever want contact, they know how to make it clear. They've approached boats peacefully before. They've also driven visitors off with arrows. They are in control of the boundary. Our obligation is to respect it. Still, their existence raises philosophical questions that are hard to ignore. Do they know we could obliterate them? Do they see our ships and helicopters as gods, monsters, or just noisy birds? Do they believe they are protecting themselves from us, or protecting us from them? We can't know without imposing our own narratives. And perhaps that's the point. Their culture doesn't exist to answer our questions. There's also a humbling analogy here, often called the zoo hypothesis, in discussions about extraterrestrial life. Imagine a far more advanced civilization knows we're here, but refrains from contact to avoid disrupting us. Watching, curious, hands off. That's us and the Sentinelese, flipped. For once we are the potentially disruptive outsiders. We are the ones who should stay behind the glass. Maybe that's not just ethical, it's instructive. Could the Sentinelese one day reach out? If they built larger, seaworthy craft and headed for Port Blair, That would be their decision. History suggests they could, but haven't. More likely, the balance continues. They live their lives. We watch the shoreline from a lawful distance. If a cyclone flattens the forest or a quake lifts the reef again, authorities may take a cautious look from the air. Otherwise, silence is golden. What we can do, ironically from far away, is remove incentives for intrusion. Enforce the 3 nautical mile exclusion. Prosecute poachers and thrill seekers. Keep shipping lanes cautious around the reefs to prevent another wreck gift. And maintain the tribal reserve status without loopholes for scientific vanity or influencer adrenaline. In the end, North Sentinel Island is both ordinary and extraordinary. Ordinary in that its people do what humans have always done: feed families, craft tools, teach children, defend home. Extraordinary in that they've managed to keep modernity at bay long enough to choose, again and again, not to join. They don't need our smartphones, our diets, our headlines, or our arguments. They need their reef, their forest, their fires, and the freedom to decide when a shoreline visitor is a neighbor or a threat. So if there's a takeaway for the rest of us, it's this: leave them alone, and mean it. Measure progress not by how many new contacts we make, but by how many boundaries we respect. If a people can thrive without us, that's not a gap to be filled. It's a success to be protected. Thanks for watching. If you made it this far, you know curiosity brought us here, but restraint is what keeps the story honest. If you found this deep dive interesting, consider sharing it and drop your thoughts below. And if you want more long-form explorations like this, you know what to do. I'll see you in the next one.